Okay, so for this lesson, we're going to be writing the equation of a trig function when we're given the graph. And for level 1, you're only going to have two kinds of transformations. You're going to have the amplitude, the A, and we'll talk about what amplitude means. And then you're going to have the M, the midline. So we need to look for two pieces of information. We need to find the amplitude and the midline of the graph. So when we're looking at our sine function, we know that the midline is right where it splits the graph in half. That means that half of the graph is going on top, half of it's going on bottom. It's right in the center, the middle of the vertical height. So for this example right here, we just saw that the midline of this one went through y equals 0 for the parent function, which makes sense because nothing is being added on to the end. Whatever the midline is, you're just going to add that on the very end of your function. Again, if you look at this one down here, the middle of this graph is again just 0, so plus 0. The amplitude is the distance from the midline to either the peak maximum or the lowest minimum point. So if I'm looking at my midline and I want to reach the maximum, I can see that it took from 0 to 1, just 1 unit to get there. That's why there's a pretend imaginary 1 being multiplied out in front of that sign. Same thing with the cosine, going from the midline, that middle point, to the amplitude. To find the amplitude, you're going to go from that midline to the highest peak, or you could do it to the lowest peak. And we can see that again, it was just 1. So there's a pretend 1 being multiplied out in front. So once you find the midline, you're going to add it to the end. Once you find the amplitude, you're going to multiply it out in front. So let's do some examples. This first one, it gives you the parent function as your solid black line, and you're trying to transform it so that it turns into the dotted line. So we're going to look at the dotted line and find out the amplitude and the midline. So starting with the midline, I can see that if this entire trig function took only 2 units from top to bottom, that means that the middle is going to be right in between the 3 and 5. So that tells me that the midline that I just created, because it was in between 3 and 5, my highest and my lowest point was 4. So I found out that my midline is y equals 4. And we know that the midline always goes at the very end, so we're adding 4 to the end. Then we can look for our amplitude. We're going to go from the midline to either the highest peak or from the midline to the lowest point. And we can see that that took from 4 to 5 or from 4 to 3, still only 1 unit. So I can put a 1 out in front. And it leaves you a blank to work inside the parentheses and transform it each time, but we're not going to need that at all for level 1. So our function transformed would be y equals 1 times cosine of x plus 4. And you would even be able to leave that 1 off because multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. For our next example, it already tells us that we're working with sine. We're trying to find how to transform the parent function in the solid line to the dotted line. So again, I'm going to look to find the midline. I can see that my dotted transformed sine function is lowest at -4 and highest at 2. If I want to find the exact middle of those 2 points, the way that I do it in my head is I know from 2 to 4, that took me 6 units. So I need to go 3 units up and 3 units down. So 3 units up would be right here. Same thing as 3 units down would still be right here. So I have my midline. I just found out that the midline was at -1. So I'm going to be subtracting 1 off the end. And now I need to find the amplitude, how high up it goes or how low it goes from the midline. And that's 1, 2, 3 units. And you could do the same down here, 1, 2, 3. Just always make sure if you're counting by the marks on your graph that you make sure that your graph is counting by ones, and it is. So our amplitude is 3. We don't need to put anything inside the parentheses. Next example, again, we're going to find the midline first. My lowest point is at -1. My highest point is at 5. That means there's a total of 6 units. So I again need to go 3 units down, 3 units up to find the midline. And the exact center is at 2. Plus 2 on the end. And again, you can count 1, 2, 3. Or you could count down here 1, 2, 3. So we have an amplitude of 3. For our last one, finding the midline, my lowest point's at -5. My highest point's at 3. That means that there's 8 total units from the highest to the lowest. So the midline's going to be 4 units up or down from the highest or the lowest, which ends up being at -1. That's a really ugly negative sign or equal sign. And now finding my amplitude, I went up 1, 2, 3, 4, or I also went down 1, 2, 3, 4. So there you go.